the political, folks and others, which is average citizens, to help advocate, for those who are marginalized because of an illness like mental illness. So I guess one strategy would be to target, just the non-mentally ill folks. Another strategy might be to maybe create a game that might empower some of our clients to take action. Maybe resources, providing resources. How can they get involved? In the voting process. Last year we had a campaign to go to the city hall, and we had several clients actually speak up and read their letters, and we had a huge. We even had a Facebook campaign. But I don't know. So I guess you can go either way.
Yeah. Well. The first thought I had was that just an interest of showing comparatively how little money you guys need. Like you could have a game, a war game where you're invading a country, but your currency is mentally health patients that it takes. You could help 1 million of them with one aircraft carrier. In other words, your currency is the same, sort of a coin. One coin can go to this person. Life for a year, I don't know. Yeah. Or it could go, 1 million of them could go to buying a big airplane. The point is that something like invading Iraq for one day could pay for all San Francisco's operations for 10 years maybe. I'm making that up, but I bet something like that, right? And so just sort of the irony of, and so using the people as currency is a very common thing, or resource is a very common thing in the game. It's sort of a biting joke on how little it would take. Because that would be educating the public about money and how cutting funding for you guys, maybe there are other places that could be cut. I'm in San Francisco, so I can say this kind of openly, right? Man, it would be a challenge to do one for the patients.
And one thing games are good at, especially this latest wave of social games that are designed for you to establish a daily practice, a routine, right, that you sort of come back to day after day, are getting people, or like getting people engaged in a way that they will turn it into a habit, right, to engage their brain in a certain way at sort of the same time every day, or at least on a regular basis, and that can be like a really useful part of therapeutic practice too, right?
There's a real trend in mental health towards pushing our clients toward normalization, and so. Employment and education, and we're trying to get them outside of the clinic. So, especially with the ones who are more stable. And so maybe if we can design a game that's geared towards these folks who are ready to go out, but they don't have know-how or the resources.
Right, well one thing play in general is really good at is giving you a kind of relatively risk-free arena to explore ideas, like to practice things, right? That's what sort of the function that play serves in a lot of different species. And so, yeah, so like to go through the motions, figure out like what kind of decision making you'll have to do in a certain situation. And one thing that games have done in the past, and I think there's a bunch of questions about this, right, is to say like, oh, okay, I'm going to put you in the position of that person who's very unlike you in some way. And what does that mean about your identity, or like, are you kind of like appropriating that experience in some way? Yeah, I know you guys have probably thought about this a lot more than me, so I'm curious to know what you think.
Yeah. My take is always to try to come up with a character, well not always, but I would imagine a character that, in any game you play, like World of Warcraft, you're both an orc and yourself. In Super Mario Brothers, you're both Super Mario and yourself, etc. Always in yourself. It's nice in a project that's serious, that can just be you. And so sometimes, I mean, that's why I put a cat in my game, because it's really nothing. It actually represents nothing but you as an activity. You, the player, are playing. So sometimes you can come up with sort of a fiction for the character, for the game, that allows someone not to think about what they're supposed to be, but who they are playing. That's kind of abstract, sorry.
I mean, yeah, in terms of, for instance, we do come across this a lot, and for instance, there was in Darfur Design, there was a great degree of effort to always have moments where the player was reminded of who they were. There had been, unfortunately, for different reasons, these other directions didn't end up being developed. But there was, sort of it often happens that the game design document is like much larger than what gets developed, unfortunately. But there was a mechanism by which you actually put in who you were encouraged to put in who you really were, right? As a student of the University of Southern California, whatever. And that double identity always stuck with you. Whatever character you were at that moment, at different moments, there were 7 Darfurians sort of that were your representation in the space, but you were also carrying your identity of a college student from NYU, and those 2 identities were very much there, and there were moments always telling you, as a person sitting and playing this game, what do you think, do you want to write a letter to a member of Congress, blah, blah, blah. So, but I also think that, it excites me, and I actually think that there's a lot that still is yet to be articulated about, the potential of role and identity in games. For me, is a very, very interesting one. And, more often, if you were to sort of take a broad survey of most games, you would find that it's relatively a kind of constrained list. But, there's no reason why a character can't be an emotion or a structure or, and that who you are and your role and what you are enacting can be a very fluid and sort of transient thing, or sort of more metaphoric, I think, than what we're used to seeing. And this is where documentary filmmakers, I think, can really sort of come to the table and work with game makers and really have an interesting discussion, because these folks and these scholars and these practitioners, documentary, have for years sort of wrestled with the issues of the politics and the ethics of representation. And now in games, if we're talking about sort of serious games or games that address nonfiction and so forth, you have, you don't only have the politics of sort of what is being represented, but also what is being simulated or what is being modeled, and you also have agency, right? You're actually enacting actions. So those ethical representations are really sort of, expand really in gameplay.
It is easier to think of games that, at least for me, that would educate the public. I just think that I was talking to a friend, he was being a little slightly hard on homeless people, and I just said a lot of them actually have mental health problems, and I didn't know what percentage. I made up a number for him. I was like, it's like 50%. and I knew there's some truth to what I said. And maybe a game where it's like a time travel game where it's about the history of homelessness in America. So homelessness might have a different meaning in 1910 as it does now, and it's about the services available, and it's about the percentage of people who are either orphans or the percentage of people who are mentally ill. And if there are even definitions for that, it might be a neat puzzle game where you're homeless, but you're ported to different decades. And in the 80s, Reagan let everyone out, right? He did budget cuts, right? And you learn, I don't know, so some relationship between homelessness and, it wouldn't on the surface be about mental health again, or mental illness. But by way of, you would say, well, what's the connection to homelessness? Is there a connection a person might have?
One thing that a lot of sort of game designers and game academics say does really well is sort of simulate systems. Because in essence, games are, they tend to be sort of these, elements that are all there, and they're all interdependent on one another, right? So that if something changes here, it tends to influence other components. And that's essentially, at a rudimentary level, the definition of a system. And so games can simulate systems fairly well, and you can add more and more layers of fidelity. Now, that may in itself not make a good game, it may make a good simulation, but the McDonald's game, for instance, that you showed is a really interesting simulation of a model as interpreted by the game designer. So it's simulating a lot of sort of truisms, but with a sort of permissive bent, and he's got an artistic agenda, he's got a political sort of opinion about it. So homelessness, has all these ramifications to the larger system that we all, civil society as a system. And so that you can start maybe from, this is highly abstract, but another way I think that maybe what you were talking about is not so much the specifics maybe of mental health, but looking at how it sort of fits in the broader system that we all sort of live in, day to day. And there is indeed a growing and very sort of active, proactive and movement looking at games and learning. And there's it's quite within the field of this work, and I think here maybe we're representing a little bit more sort of like games with an artistic bent, but there's definitely a lot of work being done in games and learning. And looking at it from a perspective of, not so much, perhaps not so much what you learn when you're playing a game, but sort of how you play, how you learn. And looking at sort of, and there's scholars that sort of would equate good learning strategies with good game design strategies. And maybe more specifically, I think that you have.
Yeah,
like,
so
games
it's almost like flipping the question on its head, right? Like what people are finding in the research about games and education is that games aren't necessarily that great for doing this sort of didactic, like, we're imprinting a bunch of facts onto your mind, but they're good for doing things like teaching systems and for letting people explore things in a deeper way, in a way that engages them in a different way than the sort of like the most old-fashioned strand of educational curriculum, right?
The standards-based stuff, I
Yeah,
guess.
and a lot of educators I've talked to about this complain about the standards-based stuff is still sort of like back in almost in the 19th century, right? In terms of like the model for like, oh, we're going to just pour all this information into students' heads. And so I think that where games are hopefully helping educators out is sort of like trying to drag that stuff into the 21st century, where we have a different model of what teaching is.
Yeah, good games have incentives built into them. And so I know with my project, I don't like being about this little moment in history. I know that at best it's just going to get a student interested enough to read about it. And so, because I agree, like if I really want to learn a chunk of information, like my whole game could be summed up in a page and a half, and I can read it, and just that would be that. I would know the same information, right? So one transition is to have games be a sort of complement to a larger curriculum, and I think a lot of us are really into that. Because I teach college, but I know that my best role is just to get them excited about essentially teaching themselves, and to make them curious and want it themselves. And of course, if it's integrated in some sort of game, and particularly if they're familiar with that activity, that's particularly powerful. Or